Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Table and Plate Project Delta podcast. Each place has its own culture and vibe, and you're joining me, Dr. Ellen Harris, as I learn, explore, discover, experience, and talk about food and culture in the Mississippi Delta. Today, my mind is asking me, what the hell is going on? Is this a call to action? This morning, my brother called me from Houston, and as we talked, he said, it may sound mean or bad, but I'm kind of glad Mama and Daddy aren't around to see what's going on now. A friend posted on Facebook the other day how this isn't the time to talk about the beauty of her garden and the blessings of new life around her. It's time to stand in her beliefs and raise her voice against the horrors of today. On social media, people are beginning to judge how folks should protest. Are these arguments constructive or divisive? Who's to judge the value of one manner of protest over another? Me personally, I can't look at the video. None of these horrific videos of shootings or assaults on our bodies, in fact. But also, I can't get this vision out of my mind of a policeman actually holding on to a human being and pumping 7 bullets into his body in front of his children. Is that what hate or seeing someone as less than human do to you? A friend told me a coworker asked her why she didn't seem her usual self. When she explained her distraught over the man being shot in the back 7 times, the coworker said, "It was karma." My friend went off. All of this is reminiscent of when they sold picture postcards back in the day of lynchings and burnings of black bodies. This constant barrage of violence and prime time medley of lies and blatant disregard for our institutions of democracy. Even though we knew these institutions were faulted, but who knew how fragile they were? This constant barrage is exhausting to the spirit and soul. However, through all of this, I go back to the episode 8 of this podcast where I said, being connected to what I eat by growing my own food gives me power. To place more emphasis on that fact, Henry Kissinger once said, if you control the food supply, you control the people. Fannie Lou Hamer said, if you give a hungry man food, he will eat. But if you give him land, he will grow his own food. And just last April 3rd, as COVID-19 was taking off, Rashid Nouri wrote, the best way for people to ensure good food supplies of quality food is to grow it themselves. Whoever controls your food controls you. That is an indisputable truth. Stated another way, if you don't control the sources of your food, someone else will. He ended his article saying, grow your own food and grow your community. With that said, the state of mind that I'm in brings me to 2 articles, both of which I've posted previously on the Third Ward Zen blog or on my Facebook Grits and Gumbo page. I want to read a little bit from each. The first article is entitled, The Great Land Robbery, the shameful story of how 1 million black families have been ripped from their farms, and was written by Van R. Newkirk II and published in The Atlantic, September 2019 issue. There are 6 sections in the article, and I'll read a little bit from each one. The first section is called Wiped Out. You ever chopped before? Well, Lena Scott White was testing me. I sat with her in the cab of a Chevy Silverado pickup truck. swatting at the squadron of giant fluttering mosquitoes that had invaded the interior of the last time she opened a window. I was spending the day with her family as they worked their fields just outside Ruleville in Mississippi's Leflore County. With her weathered brown hands, Scott White gave me a pork sandwich wrapped in a grease-stained paper towel. I slapped my leg. Mosquitoes can bite through denim, it turns out. Cotton sowed with planters must be chopped, thinned, and weeded manually with hoes to produce orderly rows of fluffy balls. The work is backbreaking, and the people who do it maintain that no other job on earth is quite as demanding. I had labored long hours over other crops, but had to admit to Scott White, a 60-something grandmother who'd grown up chopping, that I'd never done it. She replied, "Then you ain't never worked." The fields alongside us as we drove were monotonous. With row crops, monotony is good, but as we toured 1,000 acres of land in Leflore and Bolivar counties straddling Route 61, Scott White pointed out the demarcations between plots. A trio of steel silos here, a post there, a patch of scruffy wilderness in the distance. Each landmark was a reminder of the Scott legacy that she had fought to keep or to regain, and she noted this with pride. Each one was also a reminder of an inheritance that had once been stolen. Drive Route 61 through the Mississippi Delta, and you'll find much of the scenery exactly as it was 50 or 75 years ago. Imposing plantations and ramshackle shotgun houses still populate the countryside from Memphis to Vicksburg. Fields stretch to the horizon. The hands that dig into the Black Delta dirt belong to people like Walina Scott White, African Americans who bear faces and names passed down from men and women who were owned here, who were kept here, and who chose to stay here, tending the same fields their forebears tended. Unlike their counterparts, even 2 or 3 generations ago, Black people living and working in the Delta today have been almost completely uprooted from the soil, as property owners, if not as laborers. In Washington County, Mississippi, where last February TIAA, the largest U.S. pension firm, reportedly bought 50,000 acres for more than $200 million, Black people make up 72% of the population, but own only 11% of the farmland, in part or in full. In Tunica County, where TIAA has acquired plantations from some of the oldest farm-owning white families in the state, Black people make up 77% of the population, but own only 6% of the farmland. In Holmes County, the 3rd blackest county in the nation, Black people make up about 80% of the population, but own only 19% of the farmland. TIAA owns plantations there too. In just a few years, a single company has accumulated a portfolio in the Delta almost equal to the remaining holdings of the African Americans who have lived on and shaped this land for centuries. This is not a story about TIAA, at least not primarily. The company's newfound dominance in the region is merely the topsoil covering a history of loss and legally sanctioned theft in which TIAA played no part. But TIAA's position is instrumental in understanding both how the crimes of Jim Crow have been laundered by time and how the legacy of ill-gotten gains has become a structural part of American life. The land was wrested first from Native Americans by force. It was then cleared, watered, and made productive for intensive agriculture by the labor of enslaved Africans, who after emancipation would come to own a portion of it. Later, through a variety of means, sometimes legal, often coercive, in many cases legal and coercive, occasionally violent, farmland owned by black people came into the hands of white people. It was aggregated into larger holdings, then aggregated again, eventually attracting the interest of Wall Street. Owners of small farms everywhere, black and white alike, have long been buffeted by larger economic forces. But what happened to black landowners in the South, and particularly in the Delta, is distinct and was propelled not only by economic change, but also by white racism and local white power. A war waged by deed of title has dispossessed 98% of black agricultural landowners in America. They have lost 12 million acres over the last century. But even that statement falsely consigns the losses to long ago history. In fact, the losses mostly occurred within living memory, from the 1950s onwards. Today, except for a handful of farmers like the Scotts who have been able to keep or get back some land, black people in this most productive corner of the Deep South own almost nothing of the bounty under their feet. The second section of the article is called Land Hunger. Driven by what W.E.B. Du Bois calls land hunger among freed men during Reconstruction, 2 generations of black workers squirreled away money and went after every available and affordable plot they could, no matter how marginal or hopeless. Some found sympathetic white landowners who would sell to them. Some squatted on unused land or acquired the few homesteads available to black people. Some followed visionary leaders to all-black utopian agrarian experiments, such as Mound Bayou in Bolivar County. It was never much, and it was never close to just. But by the early 20th century, black people had something to hold on to. In 1900, according to the historian James C. Cobb, black landowners in Tunica County outnumbered white ones 3-1. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, there were 25,000 black farm operators in 1910, an increase of almost 20% from 1900. Black farmland in Mississippi totaled 2.2 million acres in 1910, some 14% of all black-owned agricultural land in the country, and the most of any state. Like so many of his forebears, Ed Scott Sr., Willena Scott White's grandfather, acquired his land through not much more than force of will. As recorded in the thick binders of family history that Willena had brought along in the truck and that we flipped through between stretches of work in the fields, his life had attained the gloss of folklore. He was born in 1886 in western Alabama, a generation removed from bondage. Spurred by that same land hunger, Scott took his young family to the Delta, seeking opportunities to farm his own property. He sharecropped and rented, and managed large farms for white planters who valued his ability to run their sprawling estates. One of these men was Palmer H. Brooks, who owned a 7,000-acre plantation in Mississippi's Lafleur and Sunflower counties. Brooks was uncommonly progressive, encouraging entrepreneurship among the black laborers on his plantation, building schools and churches for them, and providing loans. Scott was ready when Brooks decided to sell plots to black laborers, and he bought his first 100 acres. He led his community under the rules already in place, appearing content with what he'd earned for his family and an environment of total segregation. He leveraged technical skills and a talent for management to impress sympathetic white people and disarm hostile ones. "Granddaddy always had nice vehicles," Scott White told me. "They were a trapping of pride in a life of toil." As was true in most rural areas at the time, a new truck was not just a flashy sign of prosperity, but also a sort of credit score. Wearing starched dress shirts served the same purpose, elevating Scott in certain respects, always within limits, even above some white farmers who drove into town in dirty overalls. The trucks got shinier as his holdings grew. By the time Scott died in 1957, he had amassed more than 1,000 acres of farmland. The third section in the article is titled "The Great Dispossession." That era of black ownership in the Delta and throughout the country was already fading by the time Scott died. As the historian Pete Daniel recounts, 500,000 black-owned farms across the country failed in the 25 years after 1950. Joe Brooks, the former president of the Emergency Land Fund, a group founded in 1972 to fight the problem of dispossession, has estimated that something on the order of 6 million acres was lost by black farmers from 1950 to 1969. That's an average of 820 acres a day, an area the size of New York Central Park, erased with each sunset. Black-owned cotton farms in the South almost completely disappeared, diminishing from 87,000 to just over 3,000 in the 1960s alone. According to the Census of Agriculture, the racial disparity in farm acreage increased in Mississippi from 1950 to 1964, when black farmers lost almost 800,000 acres of land. An analysis for The Atlantic by a research team translates this land loss into a financial loss, including both property and income, of $3.7 billion to $6.6 billion in today's dollars. Analyzing the history of federal programs, the Emergency Land Fund emphasizes a key distinction. While most of the land loss appears on its face to have been through legal mechanisms, the tax sale, the partition sale, and the foreclosure, it mainly stemmed from illegal pressures, including discrimination in federal and state programs, swindles by lawyers and speculators, unlawful denials of private loans, and even outright acts of violence or intimidation. Discriminatory land servicing and loan denial by white-controlled FMHA and ASCS committees forced black farmers into foreclosure, after which their property could be purchased by wealthy landowners, almost all of whom were white. Discrimination by private lenders had the same result. Many black farmers who escaped foreclosure were defrauded by white tax assessors who set assessments too high, leading to unaffordable tax obligations. The inevitable result, tax sales, where again the land was purchased by wealthy white people. Black people's lack of access to legal services complicated inheritances and put family claims to title in jeopardy. Lynchings, police brutality, and other forms of intimidation were sometimes used to dispossess black farmers. And even when land wasn't a motivation for such actions, much of the violence left land without an owner. These cases of dispossession can only be called theft, while the civil rights era is remembered as a time of victories against segregation, many realities never changed. The engine of white wealth built on kleptocracy, which powered both Jim Crow and slave state precursor, continued to run. The black population in Mississippi declined by almost one-fifth from 1950 to 1970, as the white population increased by the exact same percentage. Farmers slipped away one by one into the night, appearing later as laborers in Chicago and Detroit. By the time black people truly gained the ballot in Mississippi, they were a clear minority, held in thrall to a white conservative supermajority. The fourth section of the article is called The Catfish Boom. World War II transformed America in many ways. It certainly transformed a generation of Southern black men. That generation included Medgar Evers, a future civil rights martyr, assassinated while leading the Mississippi NAACP. He served in a segregated transportation company in Europe during the war. It included Walena's father, Ed Scott Jr., who also served in a segregated transportation company. These men were less patient, more defiant, and in many ways more reckless than their fathers and grandfathers had been. They chafed under a system that forced them to relearn how to bow and scrape, as if the war had never happened. In the younger Scott's case, wartime service sharpened his inherited land hunger, pushing him to seek more land and greater financial independence, both for himself and for his community. One of his siblings told his biographer Julian Rankin that the family's deepest conviction was that 1,000,000 years from now, this land will still be Scott's land. Upon his return to the Delta, Scott continued down his father's hard path, avoiding any interference with the FMHA and the public portions of the agri-government system, which by that time had spread its tentacles throughout Sunflower and Leflore counties. He leaned on the friendships he and his father had made with local business owners and farmers, and secured credit for growing his holdings from friendly white bankers. He used his status to provide opportunities for other black farmers and laborers. Daddy said that everyone who worked for us would always be able to eat. Walena Scott White told me. He made sure of more than that. Scott sent relatives and tenants' children to school, paid for books, helped people open bank accounts, and buy their own land. When civil rights activists made their way down for Mississippi's Freedom Summer in 1964, he packed up meals and brought them to rallies. We lived in something like a utopia, Scott White told me, but things changed at the tail end of the 1970s. Plummeting commodity prices forced highly leveraged farmers to seek loans wherever they could find them. Combined with the accelerating inflation of that decade, the beginnings of the farm credit crisis made farming at scale without federal assistance impossible. Yet federal help, even then, 2 decades after the Civil Rights Act, was not available for most black farmers. As Rankin tells it in his biography, Catfish Dream, Scott made his first visit to an FMHA office in 1978 with the assistance of Vance Nimrod, a white man who worked with the black-owned Delta Foundation, a nonprofit promoting economic advancement for black Mississippians. Scott secured an operating loan for a season of soybeans and rice from the FMHA agent Delbert Edwards. The first time was easy, although crucially, Nimrod accompanied him to the Leflore County office in Greenwood. When Scott returned the next year without Nimrod, driving a shiny new truck the way his father used to, Edwards asked where Nimrod was. According to Rankin, Scott told the agent that Nimrod had only come to help secure that first loan. He wasn't a business partner. When Edwards saw Scott's vehicle, he seemed perplexed. "Who told you to buy a new truck?" he asked. Edwards ended up denying the requested loan amount. Scott decided to get into Catfish anyway, digging 8 ponds and fields where rice had grown the season before. He found his own catfish stocks and learned the ins and outs of the industry pretty much on his own. Scott finished digging his ponds in 1981, at which point, according to Rankin, Edwards of the FMHA visited the property and told him point blank, Don't think I'm giving you any damn money for that dirt you're moving." The Mississippi FMHA would eventually compel Edwards to provide loans for Scott's catfish operation for 1981 and 1983. But as court records show, the amount approved was far less than what white catfish farmers usually got. White farmers sometimes received double or triple the amount per acre that Scott did, and he received enough to stock only 4 of the 8 ponds. Scott's Fresh Catfish Company opened in 1983. As a marker outside the old processing shed now indicates, it was the first catfish plant in the country owned by an African American. But discrimination doomed the enterprise before it really began. Without enough capital, Scott was never able to raise fish at the volume he needed. Scott was in his 60s by the time his plant got off the ground. The effort took a toll. He slowly went blind. Arthritis claimed his joints. His heart began to fail. The plant limped quietly through the 80s and then shut down. The downfall of the Scott Catfish enterprise was proof of the strength and endurance of what the federal government would later state could be seen as a federally funded conspiracy to force minority and disadvantaged farmers off their land through discriminatory loan practices. The Scotts were not small-timers. They had the kind of work ethic and country savvy that are usually respected around the Delta. When the powers that be finally prevailed over Ed Scott Jr., they had completed something decisive, something that even today feels as if it cannot be undone. The 5th section of the article, Farmers in Suits. But land is never really lost, not in America. 12 million acres of farmland in a country that has become a global breadbasket carries immense value, and the dispossessed land in the Delta is some of the most productive in America. The soil on the alluvial plain is rich. The region is warm and wet. Much of the land is perfect for industrialized agriculture. Over the past 20 years, the real power brokers in the Delta are less likely to be good old boys and more likely to be suited venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, and agribusiness consultants who run farms with the cold precision of giant circuit boards. But even assuming that every acre under management by big corporate interest in the Delta has been acquired by way of ethical investment principles, the nature of the mid-century dispossession and its multiple layers of litigation raise the question of whether responsible investment in farmland there is even possible. As a people and a class, black farmers were plainly targets. But the deed histories of tax sales and foreclosures don't reveal whether individual debtors were moved off the land because of discrimination and its legal tools. What we do know is that whatever the specific lineage of each acre, Wall Street investors have found a lucrative new asset class whose origins lie in part in mass dispossession. We know that the vast majority of black farmland in the country is no longer in black hands, and that black farmers have suffered far more hardships than white farmers have. The historian Deborah A. Reed points out that between 1920 and 1997, the number of African Americans who farmed decreased by 98%, while white Americans who farmed declined by 66%. Referring to the cases studied in their 2001 investigation, Dolores Barkley and Todd Lewin of the Associated Press observed that virtually all of the property lost by black farmers is owned by whites or corporations. The foundation of these portfolios was a system of plantations whose owners created the agri-government system and absorbed thousands of small black-owned farms into ever larger white-owned farms. America has its own class of landlords and land grabbers who used a mix of legitimate means, fraud, and violence to force small farmers off their land, and they stand on land that was once someone else's. The last section of the article is called A Deeper Excavation. Late in Ed Scott's life, as he slipped into Alzheimer's, Willena and his lawyer, Phil Frost, fought to keep his original hopes alive. In the Pickford versus Glickman lawsuit in 1997, thousands of black farmers and their families won settlements against the USDA for discrimination that had occurred between 1981 and the end of 1996. The outlays ultimately reached a total of $2 billion. The Scotts were one of those families, and after a long battle to prove their case, with the assistance of Scott White's meticulous notes and family history, in 2012, the family was awarded more than $6 million in economic damages, plus almost $400,000 in other damages and debt forgiveness. The court also helped the Scotts reclaim land possessed by the department. Any such excavation would quickly make plain the consequences of what occurred. During my drive with Scott White, we traveled through parts of Lafleur, Sunflower, and Washington counties, three of the counties singled out by Opportunity Insights, a Harvard University research group, as among the worst in the country in terms of a child's prospects for upward mobility. 10 counties in the Delta are among the poorest 50 in America. According to new data from the CDC, on all 74,000 U.S. census tracts, 4 tracts in the Delta are among the lowest 100 when it comes to average life expectancy. More than 30 tracts in the Delta have an average life expectancy below 70. The national average is 79. In some Delta counties, the infant mortality rate is more than double the nationwide rate. As if to add gratuitous insult to injury, a new analysis from ProPublica finds that as a result of the IRS's intense scrutiny of low-income taxpayers, the Delta is audited by the IRS more heavily than any other place in the country. In sum, the areas of deepest poverty and under the darkest shadow of death are the ones where dispossession was the most far-reaching. Each black farmer who left the region from Reconstruction onward represented a tiny withdrawal from one side of a cosmic balance sheet and a deposit on the other side. This dynamic would only continue in other ways and other places as the Great Migration brought black families to northern cities. This cosmic balance sheet underpins the national conversation ever more robust about reparations for black Americans. But that conversation too easily becomes technical. How do we quantify discrimination? How do we define who was discriminated against? How do we repay those people according to what has been defined and quantified? The idea of reparations sometimes seems like a problem of economic right-sizing, something for the quants and the wonks to work out. Economics is, of course, a major consideration, but money does not define every dimension of land theft. There's a reason the fabled promise that spread among freedmen after the Civil War was not a check, a job, or a refundable tax credit, but 40 acres of farmland to call home. The history of the Delta suggests that any conversation about reparations might need to be more qualitative and intangible than it is, and it must consider the land. Land hunger is ineffable, an indescribable yearning, and yet it is something that Americans perhaps uniquely feel and understand. That yearning tugged at me hardest as Willena Scott White rounded out our tour of the fields, the afternoon slipping away. Out among the Scots fields is a clearing with a lone, tall tree. In the clearing is a small cemetery. A handful of crooked, weathered tombstones stand sentinel. This is where Ed Scott Jr. is buried, and where some of Willena's older siblings now rest. Willena posed for a picture beside her parents' grave. She told me that this is where her own bones will rest after her work on earth is done. The article ends with Mrs. Willena Scott White saying, "This is our land." And because we are a strong people, I'll end on a hopeful note by reading the second article by Victoria Moorwood, published online by Revolt, August 28, 2020, entitled 19 Families Buy Over 90 Acres of Land to Create a Safe City for Black People. A group of 19 families purchased almost 97 acres of land in Toomsboro, Georgia, to plant the seeds for a thriving new city. Georgia-based realtor Ashley Scott launched the Freedom Georgia Initiative with her friend, entrepreneur and investor Renee Walters to spearhead the purchase. In an op-ed published on Blavity, Scott said it was the tragic death of Ahmaud Arbery, a Black young man who was killed while out for jogging, that inspired her to seek therapy and eventually establish a community in Georgia where Black people can feel safe. I sought counseling from Black therapists, and it helped. It helped me to realize that what we as Black people are suffering from is racial trauma. We are dealing with systematic racism. Scott wrote, "We are dealing with deep-rooted issues that will require more than protesting in the streets. It will take for us as a people, as Atlanta rapper and activist Killer Mike so eloquently put, to plot, plan, strategize, organize, and mobilize." So that's what I and my good friend Renee Walters did. After launching their Freedom Georgia initiative, Scott and Walters attended local city council and zoning meetings. Then she and 19 other families came together to purchase the large amount of land in Toomsboro. "We figured we could try to fix a broken system, or we could start fresh," she wrote. "Start a city that could be a shining example of being the change you want to see. We wanted to be more involved in creating the lives we really want for our Black families, and maybe, just maybe, create some generational wealth for ourselves by investing in the land, investing in creating a community that is built around our core values and beliefs." Scott plans to equip their newly owned land with Black farmers, vendors, suppliers, and contractors. On Freedom Georgia's Facebook page, it notes that it hopes to be an innovative model for self-sufficiency, environmental sustainability, and cooperative economics among BIPOC communities across the African diaspora globally. Amass land, develop affordable housing for yourself, build your own food systems, build manufacturing and supply chains, build your own homeschool communities, build your own banks and credit unions, build your own cities, build your own police departments, tax yourselves, and vote in a mayor and city council you can trust, Scott concluded in her op-ed. Build it from scratch. Then go get all the money the United States of America has available for government entities and get them bonds. This is how we build our new Black Wall Streets. In closing, everyone, I just want to say I hope this information has been or will be of value to you. And please stay strong and take care of your mind, body, and spirit. Take care.